Thank you for listening to Badsey's Big Dig Talk. My name's Nina O'Hare. I work for Worcestershire Archive and Archaeology Service, and I've also been the one running the wider project behind Badsey's Big Dig. I'm going to talk a little bit, first of all, about the wider project and the ideas behind Badsey's Big Dig, then look at the test pits individually before looking at the wider stories when we put all of this information together. So first of all, Small Pits, Big Ideas is a community archaeology project that's been taking place across Worcestershire. The project's been specifically investigating rural medieval settlements, so villages that we still live in today that are known to have old origins. We've had big digs in 6 places around the county, of which Badsey is one of them. The excavations all started in autumn 2021 and ran until last summer. Project's coming towards the end now, and this talk is part of the series of kind of final reports and talks and exhibitions at the end of the project. The project has been as much about research as it has been about getting people involved and having a hands-on go at archaeology. What we've been really trying to find out about is the story of our villages, and specifically the villages we still live in today. So what we've been wanting to find out through the test pits and the big digs is how old are our villages, when did they first appear, how did they change over time, and how does the story of the villages we live in today differ or kind of share similarities with the story of villages that were deserted during the medieval period. So it's thought in England as a whole that villages started to appear between the 10th and the 12th centuries. This is a very broad brush idea, and it comes mostly from excavations of deserted sites. So as an archaeologist sensibly pointed out, the story of those villages, the ones that were deserted a long time ago, might not be the same as the story of villages that people have carried on living in and still live in today. There has been some work in other parts of the country looking at villages people still live in, but not very much in Worcestershire. So what we want to know is what's going on here. Now, obviously, if you're wanting to dig somewhere that people are living, it's not as easy as a deserted site. In a deserted village, it's usually open fields. You can dig as many trenches as you want, which is by and large why so many have been excavated and ones we still live in haven't. But what you can do in current villages is to excavate test pits. So these are just 1 by 1 metre square. They're quite small. They can fit into most gardens and kind of open green spaces. The idea behind test pits is that we're looking for all the rubbish that people threw out in the past because it didn't travel very far. So unlike today, when our rubbish bins come and get collected by the council, taken off to a big landfill site, in the past no one came and did that. So rubbish tended to travel as far as people were prepared to throw it, which is often kind of the nearest ditch, manure heap, or just literally out the back of a house. The great thing about this is that it means if we can find everything that people threw out, we know that we're near to where people are living. So if we find medieval pottery, and we find a lot of it, we know that we're pretty close to a medieval house. So we don't actually have to excavate the house and find evidence of the building in order to know that people must have been living near that spot at that date. The project has focused in particular on pottery because it's quite easy to date without needing scientific kind of techniques. Fashions change with pottery, as with many other things, over time. And so as fashions change and styles change, so did pottery. So one test pit will give you quite a good idea about what occupation was going on around that site throughout history. When you've got a lot of test pits across a village, you get the story of that whole settlement, how people were perhaps moving around it as the village perhaps expanded or contracted over time. And if you do that in lots of villages across the whole region, you get an even bigger story of places where people were going to perhaps at certain dates and moving away from at other times. So over in East Anglia, there's been a lot of test pitting carried out, primarily by Professor Carenza Lewis. that has revealed really interesting stories about the impact of the Black Death in particular, which seems to have very severely impacted a lot of the villages in East Anglia. Now that's all fascinating, but what we're really interested to find out about is what's going on in the West Midlands and in Worcestershire. Have we got the same stories going on, or have we got different things going on? So, on to Badsey itself. Just want to give a little bit of the history that's already known about Badsey. So this isn't an extensive sort of recount of everything that's known, just a few key highlights. So the first thing to say is that there are quite a lot of archaeological finds already known in and around Badsey. The village and sort of neighbouring parishes have quite a lot of prehistoric and Roman activity going on. There's various, particularly Roman sites suggested in Badsey itself, and all along the Broadway and Badsey Brook, which runs between the two settlements, there's a lot of prehistoric activity going on. Within Badsey itself, there have also been several Anglo-Saxon coins found, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner photograph. These are pretty rare to find. The Anglo-Saxon era in Worcestershire in particular is very, very hard to see in terms of archaeology. People seem to have left quite a light trace on the ground. Probably a lot of buildings were wooden. They didn't use huge amounts of pottery and probably made a lot of organic things. So compared with the Roman period beforehand, when there was a lot of pottery in use that survives very well in the ground, we just don't see that time period very well. So although only a few Anglo-Saxon coins have been found in Badsey, that is quite significant. Also during the Saxon era, there are historic mentions in documents of a settlement around Badsey. The name first appears in the 8th century. So we know that there is a place somewhere in the area of the parish from that date onwards. And then the Domesday Survey of 1086, which is a big survey that the Normans undertook to record everything that they now owned. Badsey is documented as being 17 households. That doesn't sound like very much today, but at the time this was a fairly sizable settlement. It was most definitely a village, but it was by no means the smallest villages out there. We also know that the church in Badsey has elements from at least the 12th century, and that's just the parts that are still standing. So there's certainly hints of medieval activity going on. Just be nice to know exactly where and a bit more about that. Just quickly to have a look at a map of the village. This is from 1885. It's the first edition Ordnance Survey map. The village you can see is mostly laid out along what's now called the High Street. So it's quite a linear settlement that curves down at the southern end towards the brook. This is really different to today. So Badsey has, since that map has been made, has grown considerably. A lot of that has been down to market gardening in the late 19th century, as well as expansion during the 20th century. But up till that date, the village was a fairly modest size and seems to, from the historic maps we have, be a fairly sort of linear settlement. So, onto the Big Dig itself. This took place last summer, actually in May rather than July. There were 19 test pits excavated. 86 people took part, either in digging the test pits or helping with the finds, and included mostly local residents, but also Badsey cubs. The aim of these test pits was to get down to the bottom of the archaeological sequence. So archaeology doesn't go on in the ground forever. There is a point at which soils no longer contain human-made artefacts and start to be the undisturbed geology. And that's the point we want, ideally, all test pits to get to. Because when we get to that point, we know that we're not missing the earliest evidence and that we've found everything there is to be found there. In Badsey, the underlying geology and kind of the soils on top, I suppose, are predominantly quite heavy clays. So the test pits, in a lot of cases, were quite hard going, and we couldn't sieve for finds from a lot of test pits, which ideally you do to pick up all the smallest things. But where you've got very heavy clay soil, that's obviously just not much of an option. So here's a map of all the test pits. They're all marked by a red dot. As you can see, we had a pretty good spread across the village, and you can see all of the individual test pit locations in the table there. So I'm going to run through these now, either sort of individually or in small groups, starting from the north and kind of working our way south. So first up, we have test pit 1, which is marked by that blue triangle. This is at the very northern end of the parish, and in an area that is just agricultural land, but is known locally as Black Banks. So there have been previous archaeological finds from Black Banks, quite a lot of Roman pottery picked up, as well as some coins. So this test pit was put there to find out a little bit more about what's going on that site, as there hasn't been any sort of formal archaeological excavation take place. So the first thing to say is that we did have a lot of Roman pottery, but we also have quite a bit of Iron Age pottery as well. So this is the time period that kind of immediately preceded the arrival of the Roman army in Britain. There are 18 sherds of pottery. They date from the Middle to the Late Iron Age, so from everything from sort of about 4000 BC up until the Roman army arrived around 43 AD. So there have been hints of Iron Age activity up at Black Banks before, but I think this is a slightly bigger assemblage and certainly kind of part of a more formal project than has been recorded before. During the Iron Age, settlements were typically roundhouses, like you can see in the picture on the top left. Farmsteads were often kind of small groups of roundhouses, so kind of sort of single-digit numbers surrounded by fields and sort of farmland around them. It's fairly common in Worcestershire, and particularly southeast Worcestershire. We see it quite a bit, where you have later Iron Age settlements that continue to be occupied during the Roman period. It's very easy to think when we draw a line throughout history and call something, one time period and then have a different time period and think that totally different things were going on. Whilst the Roman army did arrive and we then moved into what we'd call the Roman era, obviously most of the population just carried on living here, and a farm that one family owned for several generations is likely to have carried on being used by that same family, who gradually probably started to adopt Roman pottery, Roman styles of doing things, but they were still the same people living here. So it's not that unusual to get farmsteads in particular that sort of carry on between the late Iron Age and into the Roman period. The Roman pottery we have from the site was considerably greater in quantity. We had 87 sherds. It spans kind of pretty much the majority of the Roman era. So we've got everything from the 1st century right up until sort of the end of the 3rd or 4th century. So that's not quite until the very end of the Roman era. The Roman army left in 410 AD, so the beginning of the 5th century. But we don't often see settlements, certainly in this part of Worcestershire, that run that late. It's quite typical that settlements end sort of late 3rd, early 4th century. I'll show you some photographs in a minute of the pottery, but as you'll see, it's pretty small and worn away pieces, which suggests that it's rolled around in the ground quite a lot since it was thrown away. So we don't seem to be directly on top of archaeological features, and this is pottery that hasn't come out of, say, a Roman ditch or an Iron Age pit, but it's been churned up in plough soil over the sort of subsequent better part of 2,000 years, really. Other finds that we had from this test pit include a little tiny iron hobnail, which is probably from a Roman sandal or a shoe. There are also some blocks of blue lias stone. During the excavation, we had a lot of excitement because it's possible that these are tesserae, so the little stones used to make Roman mosaics. They certainly look like they're the right size and sort of shape that you get Roman tesserae in. blue lias does break naturally though into blocks. So we can't say for certain whether or not these were used for a mosaic. It's possible these are just natural. Well, these do naturally occur like that. It's obviously possible though that people may have used them to build, to make a sort of mosaic style surface, without actually finding any sort of in situ in the ground. It's hard to say that they definitely were used for that. So just to show you, this is a photograph of some of the middle to late Iron Age pottery. It's all pretty small and worn. The sherd in the bottom right hand corner is actually the rim of a little pot. The top's very, very straight, as you can see there. This was probably a small jar, but the others, unfortunately, are all bits that kind of come from the sides of pots, and you can't quite see what shape they'd have originally been. The Roman pottery, similarly, is very small, quite worn pieces. So these have been churned up in the ground for a very long time. It's not an archaeological feature that's been disturbed recently, and kind of the finds brought to the surface because of kind of recent activity. But these have been rolled around probably for centuries in the ground. The Roman pottery on that slide is mostly something called Severn Valley ware. So that's the big group of orange sherds, more towards the top right. That's the most common type of pottery we see in Worcestershire, but there are several other types of pottery present, including some that you see in North Gloucestershire as well, and a couple of little bits near the top left of Samian ware. This is pottery with a very glossy orange surface that was made in Gaul, so modern day France, and it was a kind of fancier tableware that you would probably have out on display to show off to kind of visitors and kind of guests in your house. And the last thing just to say about test pit 1 is that we did have a couple of large stones near the bottom bits. These are about 40 centimetres down in the ground. They're below the layer of the modern sort of plough soil, and they're a bit of a mystery. As you can see, the dig team there were puzzling over them at the time. They're still a little bit of a mystery. They appear to be a single layer, so there didn't seem to be any stones underneath. Although initially it looked like we might have a bit of a line, and obviously the first thought is actually we've got a bit of a wall. What you can't quite see in that photograph is they didn't quite form a straight line. It is only one layer, and actually we can't see what they're cut into. So the soil kind of around them, both sort of above and below and either side, seems to be very similar, which archaeologically speaking can't quite always be the case. You've got to have the soil underneath has got to be there first in order to put stones in, and before soil on top can build up. And I think really what this is that archaeological features are often too big to see in a test pit. So test pits aren't the right method to investigate anything really more beyond than finds assemblages. If you start getting ditches and pits and walls in a test pit, you're just going to struggle to see exactly what they are because the area you're looking at is too small. It's a bit like having kind of a pinhole to look through and try and see what was going on, rather than being able to kind of open a big window onto what was there. One possibility, which is slightly less glamorous than a Roman wall, but is that these are part of sort of an earlier land drain. So it's fairly common to find across our fields various types of drainage. So obviously later on people put ceramic land drains in. Earlier than that, you do get sort of stone lines, either lines of stone or sort of stone-lined drains to help water sort of filter away. Admittedly, they don't usually use stones quite as large as that one on the right. But there's not many other explanations that immediately spring to mind for sort of a few few stones, a single layer of them, not quite in a line, and quite what they were for. So certainly something going on there, but I think a little bit more than we're going to be able to tell from that single metre square. So test pits 2 and 3 were a little bit further south. We wanted to be able to see that Roman site that is obviously somewhere very near to test pit 1, perhaps not quite right on top of it, but it clearly is in the vicinity of test pit 1. How far out did it spread? So what did we see in test pits 2 and 3? So these test pits both contained 3 sherds of Roman pottery. They were 3 very rolled around, tiny little sherds that do seem to perhaps travelled a bit of a way, been dragged kind of in plough soil. Obviously a much smaller quantity than we've had in test pit 1. And I think what that's telling us is that actually we are sort of right on the edge of this settlement by the time we get out to test pits 2 and 3. And that the direction the settlement is going in is probably a bit further north, perhaps of test pit 1, rather than south. Besides the Roman finds, there was a small quantity of Victorian material in these 2 test pits, so little bits of pottery. There was a little handle of a china cup from test pit 3, and from test pit 2 we've had a George V sixpence. So a few later things, but not very much at all, which does really fit with the fact that these are both gardens of modern houses, that actually there doesn't seem to be much activity going on here before those houses were built. So test pits 4 and 5 are along Sinehurst Crescent, so moving a little bit further south. So Sinehurst Crescent was first laid out in the 1930s. So these are again 2 sort of 20th century houses. Both of these test pits produced predominantly sort of Victorian finds. So test pit 4 had a few things that kind of predate that a little bit, with some late 18th century things, and test pit 5 was a little bit later on, with finds mostly coming from sort of the late Victorian era onwards. There was a mix of pottery, glass, bits of metalworking, I think some little bits of animal bone as well. And from test pit 5 we had this very nice little ceramic white bead, which as you can see in the photograph is really quite tiny. It's about a centimetre kind of across. These are quite hard to date just by themselves. I think given the other finds that came out from test pit 5, this is probably Victorian or a little bit later. Interestingly, from these 2 test pits, the finds were all quite small bits, quite worn and rolled around again, and they look like the sort of material you would find in agricultural areas. So it was quite common for rubbish to be thrown on manure heaps that were then spread with the manure over fields, and then those finds get kind of gradually worked into the ground as it's ploughed or dug over. That seems to be the case of what we've got going on here, and that would certainly fit with historic mapping, because before the 1930s and the current houses were built, the area is just recorded as agricultural land on the 19th century mapping. Interestingly though, there is no medieval pottery from these 2 test pits at all. We're not too far from Badsey High Street, and we might expect to see that if the medieval settlement had been along there, that actually this would have been agricultural land around the village, and even if we're not on top of the medieval village, that we would see some signs that they were fields that were being worked and get little bits of medieval pottery kind of mixed into the ground. So it's kind of quite striking that actually we don't have any of that going on here. So moving a bit further south, test pit 6 was just off the high street, and test pits 7 and 8 were along what is now Seaward Road. So these were all on bits of land that historically were plots leading off the high street, and lots of long linear plots that led from houses fronting on to the high street, going kind of east-west back to the brook. So all three of these test pits pretty much produced finds from the late 17th century onwards. So that's a little bit earlier than we've just seen in test pits 4 and 5. So kind of interesting, moving a bit further south, certainly a bit nearer to where the church is, perhaps moving a little bit earlier, a bit nearer to the earlier part of the village. Test pit 6 was fairly near to the manor house, which is obviously a very old building in itself. This test pit we had pretty high hopes for, and we thought would likely produce quite a bit of medieval material. Interestingly, whilst we did have bits dating from the 17th century onwards, we didn't get anything earlier. Now, some of this might be that we did hit quite a lot of building rubble. It looks like there's perhaps been some modern disturbance. We weren't able to get to the bottom of this test pit, and the ground is pretty churned up from either the ground being sort of worked over or perhaps outbuildings kind of being knocked down. But if it's been quite churned up the ground, and if there's lots of medieval pottery to be found, you might expect to still see it in that test pit. So it's interesting that we didn't, but certainly isn't conclusive that, there may well be medieval activity sort of just further down than we were able to excavate in test pit 6. Test pit 7, although it was in Seawood Road, it was actually a little bit closer to the front of what, the houses that had fronted the high street originally. This test pit was really deep, and a bit like test pit 6, it was really well churned up. So there were some quite modern finds pretty deep down in this test pit. Interestingly, though, we do have a piece of medieval pottery from test pit 7. So that's the piece on the slide, photographed on the slide there. It's part of a medieval cooking pot, which is the majority of the medieval pottery we find comes from cooking pots. They looked a bit like that drawing at the bottom, so fairly straight sides, flattish bottom. They're made around the Worcestershire area in particular, from the late 11th century to the mid 14th century onwards. So kind of throughout the kind of high medieval period. Interestingly, that piece of pottery is, although it's a little bit worn, it's got sharper edges than I think I would expect for a piece of pottery that has been extensively rolled around in plough soil for centuries and centuries. So actually, I think that piece, although it is just one piece, probably has come from nearer to occupation, nearer to where it was thrown away, than perhaps might be expected. So more likely to be nearer occupation than kind of fields out in the sticks that, travelled a good mile or so from where people were actually living. Test pit 8 was out by the brook, with a garden kind of that back down onto the brook line. This test pit didn't produce any medieval pottery, but interestingly did produce a sherd of Roman pottery. So kind of a little bit of a surprise that although we weren't near Black Banks, there's bits of Roman material starting to come up elsewhere. So just to show some more of the finds from test pit 7 in particular, although these are the similar sorts of finds we've had from test pit 6 and test pit 8 as well. So this is a photograph of all the 17th to 18th century pottery. The top two pieces in the left-hand corner are imaginatively named buffware. So a lot of archaeological pottery types have fairly obvious names, as you'll see. But those two pieces are quite distinctive style of pottery. So it's a type of pottery that has a glaze on top. There's stuff made in Staffordshire that is usually yellow and brown stripy. So that piece on the left is pretty distinctive. And it's one of those ones that's kind of older than you might expect. It's got, in some ways, quite a modern design on it. All of the pieces on the right come from something called redware, which had a black shiny glaze on it, but the kind of fabric, the main sort of clay of the pot, was red, hence the name. The top two pieces are rims of pots. We've also got part of a handle. These are the kind of one of the most common sort of utilitarian types of pottery in the 17th and 18th centuries. You get chamber pots made out of this. You get panchions, which are big flared bowls for making bread or separating cream, things like that. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, we have a little bit of something a little bit more decorative, which is a hand-painted tin glazed pottery. So a selection of different things going on. And just to show you as well, here's an example, selection of the china, so sort of 19th, 20th century china that was found in Test Pit 7 as well. So moving on now to Brewer's Lane, Test Pits 9, 10 and 11. So Test Pit 9 is in the garden of a late Victorian house. The house was built in the 1890s. We had a lot of building material, bits of brick and tile, as you perhaps might expect. But interestingly, we do have a few finds that predate the house being there. So a few things from the late 17th century onwards. These bits aren't very many in number though, they are quite small, and this is more typical of the pottery you would expect from that manure scatter. So this part of Brewer's Lane on historic mapping is shown as being agricultural, and that does fit with the finds really that have come up from Test Pit 9, that we're near enough to the 17th and 18th century occupation that we get kind of the finds that have been ploughed into the fields, but not quite near enough to get kind of big bits of it. Test Pit 10 was further back towards the centre of the village, so this is actually just a little way northeast of the church. And again, although this is a modern house, this was a fairly shallow test pit with, interestingly, a slightly earlier piece of pottery in it. So this had a piece of pottery dated from the late 15th to the early 17th century, as well as a bit of that redware. So like we saw from Test Pit 7, that sort of 17th, 18th century, a bit like that, those panchions, that big flared bowl illustrated in the bottom corner. So interestingly, actually, that slightly earlier material is turning up a little bit nearer to the church. The Test Pit 10 was very shallow, and it's possible that the ground there has been truncated when the current house was built. So that might explain why we didn't have more earlier finds. You perhaps predict that you might get medieval finds there. Interestingly, there weren't any, but certainly some earlier than we've seen in most of the other test pits. Test Pit 11 was again a little bit further east, and this was at 22 Brewer's Lane. Now this is the garden of a cottage that is set back a little way south of Brewer's Lane and is recorded on historic mapping. So it's thought that the cottage is probably 18th century in date. And unlike Test Pits 9 and 10, which produced some but a relatively small number of quite small finds, Test Pit 11 produced a vast quantity of pottery, but also glass, bits of metalwork, animal bone, and all sorts that was going on there. So it seems with Test Pit 11 actually we really hit what we were looking for, which is all the rubbish that's been dumped. And in a lot of cases, I think the rubbish we found at Test Pit 11 has been dumped and then not moved until we found it with the test pit. So this is great news. This is exactly what we're looking for. Should say as well though, this test pit didn't quite get down to the natural geology. So although the finds fit broadly with the date of the cottage, possibly slightly bit earlier, but broadly fitting, it is possible that there's earlier activity there that we didn't see. So here's a photograph of some of that black glazed redware that we saw also in Test Pit 7 and a lot of other test pits. As you can see, there's a really, really large piece at the top, which is the rim of a panchion, so those flared bowls. There's also quite a lot of other large pieces. So this is looking like a kind of primary rubbish dump, and it just hasn't moved far, or if at all, from having been thrown away. A couple of other interesting finds we had is part of a button mould. So this is the photograph in the top corner. It's made out of bone. It would have been a whole disc with a little hole in the middle. We've only kind of got just under half of it. Now, these were common, particularly in the 1700s, toward the end of that sort of end of the Georgian era. They were usually covered either in fabric or in thread. So it was really a way of making buttons that matched whatever clothing you were going to make. So that you didn't buy a pre-made button to match. You bought button molds and then you made it to match whatever items of clothing you were making. We've also got from there a lot of adjoining pieces of something called a mocha-ware bowl. So this would have been a smallish bowl with quite striking patterns on the outside. Now these were made between sort of about 1850 and 1950, and it's a very distinctive style of decoration that's usually either a bit feather-like or a little bit tree-like. And it was made by sort of dropping the paint on, and given the kind of chemical sort of composition of the surface of the pot and the paint that was going on, it kind of spread out into these patterns. So we're moving now to the west side of the high street, to two test pits 12 and 14 that were in Seaward Road, and then to test pit 17, which is a little bit further south in Mill Lane. So these test pits, like a lot of our other test pits we've seen so far, produced finds generally from the 17th or 18th century onwards. We had a couple of surprising things as well though. So first up in test pit 12, this is again a modern house, but wasn't too far from the back of the high street. We have the base in particular, part of something called a tig, which you can see in the drawing at the top there. So tigs were multi-handled cups that you would use for sharing with other people. So sometimes they have 2 handles, sometimes they have 3. And the idea is that you would drink from the bit of the cup that was by your handle. It's kind of in the interests of hygiene, really. If you have to share cups, at least designate which part of the cup you're going to drink from. They're common, particularly in the 17th century. So that's a really nice find from test pit 12. Kind of even older than that, though, we have 2 bits of medieval pottery. Now, these are both in the bottom photograph. I know they don't look like much, but I promise you they are quite interesting. The piece on the left is part of a Worcestershire cooking pot, so like some of the other bits of medieval pottery we've seen. The bit on the right, although it looks very similar on the surface, is actually a totally different style of pottery that was made around Wiltshire. So it's called Newbury ware. Again, not a very imaginative name, but it's thought to have been made in the Upper Kennet Valley in Wiltshire. They're most common from the 12th to the 13th century, so this is quite an early medieval piece of pottery. They're really quite rare to find in Worcestershire. They have been known from other sites, but not very many, and where they do turn up, they tend to turn up in a really small quantity. So actually this is really quite a significant thing to find, and it's certainly the earliest non-local bit of medieval pottery that's been found in Badsey. So something quite special there, even though it doesn't look shiny on the surface. So test pit 14, again we have another piece of non-local medieval pottery. This is another modern house, but it does back onto the Badsey Lane, which may well have been a sort of ancient, much older route way. It's a little bit of a hollow way at that point, where the garden of number 57 backs onto it. So the bit of pottery we have is that quite bright, slightly modern looking green piece in the bottom photograph. It's the rim of a jug. You can see what the hole might have looked like in that photograph on the left. It has a green glaze on it, and it was made around Brill and Borstal in Buckinghamshire. This is something that, again, we don't often see in Worcestershire, but is more common than the Newbury ware. So we have had other test pits elsewhere during this project that have found Brill Borstal pottery, so particularly in Bearley, more generally the sort of west side of Worcestershire. But those jugs tend to date from the 13th and the 14th centuries. So this is pottery that people are bringing in that's often the kind of nicer tablewares that is worth trading along the way. Cooking pots are made locally. There's not much point bringing those in, but some of the finer tablewares we do see travelling a little bit further during this date. Now test bit 17, it's a bit further south, and this was at Sunley in Mill Lane. So this area of land was formerly mill orchard, and it was sort of in the vicinity of the vicarage, what used to be the vicarage there. This test bit was really quite deep and contained a very thick layer with a lot of charcoal, Victorian china, interesting bits, got some glass marbles, so some children's toys, iron nails, bits of brick and tile, quite a lot of glass fragments. And interestingly, some of the animal bone shows signs of being kitchen waste, so things that have been butchered, probably joints of meat that have been eaten by a household at some point in the past, which is what you can see that bottom photograph on the right there. So this is quite a thick build-up, but primarily from the Victorian era onwards. And it might well come from somewhere like the vicarage, that was wanting to kind of throw their rubbish away, not in their nice grounds around their house, but just a little bit further out of the way, or from other kind of similar properties around Mill Lane. So interestingly, nothing considerably earlier, but certainly since that date, quite a big build-up of rubbish that's been dumped around that area. So moving back now to the east side of the High Street, and we're going to be at number 27, which is the Firs, and it's just immediately south of the church. So a very intriguing place to be. Obviously, you might well expect that the earliest medieval settlement would be near to the church. These are kind of buildings that are medieval in origin. So the first thing to say is that this test pit had a bit of everything. The earliest thing we had from this test pit is a bit of Roman pottery, just one piece. So clearly we know there's Roman activity going on in the area. It's interesting that seems to be travelling quite away, or at least certainly there's perhaps activity nearer by than we think. The bottom two layers of this test pit seem to contain undisturbed medieval layers. So there was 9 bits of medieval pottery, which is a much bigger quantity than we've had elsewhere. It's not just the quantity that's interesting, but it didn't come turned up with all the other finds and all the kind of later things. It primarily came out of spits 4 and 5, and alongside it there was just animal bone, bits of fired clay and iron objects. Those things are hard to date in and of themselves, certainly without doing scientific dating. They might well be a bit earlier or later than the medieval period, but they certainly don't contradict that medieval date. They could all feasibly be medieval in date, and it's interesting that we have a total absence of later pottery. So it certainly looks like we might well have occupation directly on this site from the medieval period onwards, and this is the first place in Badsey that we've actually seen this. All the other hints of medieval activity have been things that have moved a bit of away from where they were originally thrown away. Interestingly, as well as medieval pottery, we have some slightly later bits, so some 16th to 18th century pottery, something called Midlands yellowware, which is yellow. Haven't photographed that because it's quite a small piece. After that, we've got those 17th and 18th century wares, so the red wares and those buff wares, those shiny, stripy Staffordshire slip wares, which you can see at the bottom. And interestingly, there's also a piece of quite early window glass. So glass, when it's in the ground, unless it's very modern, made with sort of modern techniques, it will start to degrade. When glass degrades, it goes metallic, it starts going opaque, so you can't see through it properly. It quite often goes a little bit flaky. The longer it's in the ground, the kind of more metallic it goes. So it's quite hard to date precisely that window glass as to exactly how old it is, but it's likely to be pre-1800. So actually it's starting to look like we've got much more evidence of people living on that site for a very long time. So just to show you the medieval pottery, all the pieces on the left-hand side are Worcestershire wares, so probably mostly cooking pots. The bits on the right are made around Malvern. There's a particularly nice bit in the top of that Malvern sort of stack, which has a diamond pattern pressed into it. The Malvern pieces would all have originally been glazed, so that diamond one has kind of lost its surface. The two bits at the bottom are potentially a little bit later in date. So whilst the Worcester wares mostly end about the 14th century, the Malvernian wares can carry on up to sort of the early 17th century. And that large sort of darker orange piece on the right there, that probably does have more of a date range of the 15th to 17th century. So kind of with those earlier Worcester pieces, that slightly later Malvern piece, and then the Midlands yellow ware, which is 16th to 18th century, we do seem to have quite good continuity throughout on this test pit. So occupation right from the early medieval period up to today. So moving now to Badsey Fields Lane. So Badsey Fields Lane we know was in existence by 1812. It's recorded on the enclosure map. But at that time, there weren't any houses along it, so it was just agricultural land at that date. Interestingly, both test pits 15 and 16 produced Roman pottery. There is a known Roman site from sort of field walking finds that people have found along Badsey Fields Lane. So that's perhaps a little bit less surprising that we've got some bits of pottery from that date. Although the bit from test pit 16, which was the one furthest east along Badsey Fields Lane, comes from the quite early Roman period, so the 1st or 2nd century. Besides those bits of Roman pottery, everything we've got from test pits 15 and 16 comes from the 17th or the 18th century onwards. So kind of general household waste, but in quite small quantities. So this is really suggesting that this is, as mapping suggests, was agricultural land, and that these are finds that found their way into fields along with that sort of manure scatter. Interestingly, as we had in Synehurst Crescent, isn't any sign of medieval activity, either direct medieval occupation or that sort of manure scatter, which you might expect. We're not too far from the high street in terms of medieval fields, and perhaps would expect to see that there. Something just slightly different I wanted to point out that we had from test pit 15 is that piece, slightly grotty looking piece in the bottom corner. Now that's a piece of burnt porcelain that's likely to come from Worcester Porcelain Works. They quite ingeniously used to sell off all their bits of kiln furniture, so kind of spacers, bits of the sort of drums that they put things in whilst they were firing them. And anything that got misfired or that broke during firing got sold off either as hardcore or as a soil improver to kind of help kind of break up the soil a little bit. So it's likely that that's what that piece was, that actually this is stuff that has been worked into the ground in the hope that perhaps might improve the soil, and that this does seem to be a very agricultural picture we have going on. So last but by no means least, we have test pits 18 and 19, which are along Sands Lane. So test pit 18 was at the recreational grounds, and this test pit was excavated by Badsey Cubs. They did really well with this test pit and got down to the natural geology, the bottom of the sequence. They found a piece of Roman pottery as well as 4 sherds of medieval pottery too. So those bits of medieval pottery, 3 of them are fairly undiagnostic. They're probably bits of cooking pot with not very tight date range, but they've also got the rim of a cooking pot, and the style is 12th to 13th century. So these are the sort of things that you might expect to see more in a field. They're quite little pieces on the whole, a bit more rolled around, but we've got 4 of them, and that's quite a considerable number compared to all the other test pits that have generally produced 1 or 2 bits. So probably looking more at a medieval field, but certainly quite a bit going on there. After that date, there's then finds from the 18th century onwards, so kind of Georgian things. Again, these look like what you'd expect in an agricultural field. It's little bits of household rubbish that have found their way out into fields. A bit later than that, we quite nicely have a 1911 penny. It's from George V. And as you can see in that photograph, there's also a Girl Guides badge. And I just think the I suppose slight irony of the Badsey Cub Scouts finding a Girl Guides badge rather than a Scouts badge is quite surprising. Out of all the groups, they had to be the one to find it. So yeah, they unfortunately didn't come across a Scout one. Moving on then to our last test pit, which was even further south. This was a strip of land south of Sands Lane. It was test pit 19. So this test pit didn't produce a huge quantity, but did have some very early finds. So 2 bits of Roman pottery, which are in the middle of that photograph at the bottom, those 2 little triangular pieces, as well as a piece of Roman roof tile. And I think this is the only Roman building material that we had from any of the test pits. So those 3 bits, as you can see in the photograph, are really well worn. They've been in plough soil for a very long time. But certainly looking like there's Roman buildings, not on that site, but certainly within the wider area. Besides that, that little slightly grottier looking piece on the right of the photograph is a bit of medieval pottery. And there was also part of a 17th century tig, so one of those multi-handled cups. It's important to say that the finds processing after the dig is as important as the excavation work itself. So there's a lot that has to happen to the finds before they can be looked at, and we know the whole story from the test pits. The finds were all cleaned and they were sorted, and some of the pottery will be marked as well. So thank you very much to everyone who took part in the finds team and for making that really important step of the process happen. So I just want to put all of the finds together now. So looking at the test pits overall, that map of Badsey shows all the test pits as dots there. The sites in black are ones that produced Roman finds, and the bigger the dot, the more pottery that was found there. So as you can see, there's a pretty big cluster up at the northern end. Definitely got a site going on there. But interestingly, there is quite a spread across the settlement as well, particularly at that southern end. So up at Black Banks, we've got that mid to late Iron Age pottery, and then Roman pottery from the 1st really through to the 4th century. So we certainly seem to have got a Iron Age going into Roman settlement up at Black Banks. There's clearly other stuff going on elsewhere in the village though as well. Interestingly, there wasn't anything sort of in the middle. So there's the finds up from up at Black Banks, then there is a bit of a gap, test pits that didn't have any Roman material in, and then again there's kind of consistently all the test pits at the southern end produced a little bit of Roman material. So there is, I think that really does attest to the amount of Roman settlement that's went on in Badsey. So in comparison, other big digs we've held in Worcestershire have typically produced some Roman pottery, but often 1 or 2 sherds across all of the test pits, whereas 9 of Badsey's test pits produced Roman material. So moving on to the medieval period, between the 12th and the 14th centuries, you can see again there the test pits in black, and the larger the dots, the test pits that found more pottery. So as you can see, only 6 test pits produce pottery, and they're all kind of clustered at the southern end of the settlement. The question that really begs is, where was Badsey's medieval village? Did it have a neat, nice village centre, or was it quite spread out? What was going on? So I think the first thing to say is that we do have one test pit that seems to have had continuous occupation since the medieval period. That was at test pit 13, which kind of perhaps unsurprisingly is just by the church. So certainly along the high street and around the church, there seems to have been medieval settlement in that area. But kind of on a more surprising note, there isn't very much medieval pottery overall. Just 6 test pits produced medieval pottery, which is a smaller number than we might expect to see. Yes, there is that cluster going on kind of at the southern end, and I think certainly it looks like the settlement didn't expand further north. And I think certainly some of the northern test pits, the lack of medieval pottery can probably be explained by the fact that the historic parish boundaries actually separated that land off. So as you can see in the enclosure map, there's an extract of it on the slide there. That was made in 1812. And up to that date, the northern end of what is now the High Street was in Aldington. So test pits up 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5, so the ones in Signhouse Crescent, those historically were part of Aldington, and they were kind of on the edge of Aldington Parish. So I think it's perhaps not surprising that if they're on a parish boundary, we didn't find very much there. But interestingly, it does suggest that those boundaries are quite old, that they're not a recent creation, and that historically those were sort of the edge of a settlement rather than the core of it. But interestingly, we don't seem to find the medieval pottery spreading very far. So it kind of generally thought that in medieval villages, you get pottery kind of travelling sometimes sort of a mile or so from where people are living, as it gets kind of taken out to the fields that are being worked around that settlement. And I would have expected in Badsey that we see a much wider spread of pottery going on than we have done. So that's kind of quite a curious thing. Interestingly, as mentioned, we've got 6 test pits that produced medieval finds, whereas we've got 9 test pits that produced Roman finds. Now, it might be that the Roman pottery just travelled much further, and they perhaps were working fields a bit further from where they were living, so we just see it as a bit of a bigger spread than we do the medieval activity. It might be that actually during the Roman era, people just used more pottery, there was more of it around to be seen. Or intriguingly, it might actually be that in the Roman era, this area was more populated than later on. Actually, by the medieval period, the population relatively was a little bit smaller, and there perhaps was just sort of one settlement here, whereas in the Roman era, there may well have been a couple of little kind of farmsteads and sort of dwellings going on in the area. And so kind of hard to make a direct comparison, but certainly an interesting one to kind of ponder over, and quite why we don't see finds spread kind of more extensively throughout the test pits in Badsey. Just quickly to say that we obviously wanted all the test pits to hit the natural geology, find the earliest material, and the Big Dig did pretty well at this. So you can see on the map all the test pits in black are the ones that hit the natural, ones in grey probably did, although without going back in a time machine, it's hard to confirm for definite. And the ones in black, the ones in red didn't hit the natural geology. So there are a few that didn't get down to the bottom, but on the whole they did fairly well. So to kind of look at Badsey's Big Dig in comparison to others we've had a look at, it is possible that Badsey was a slightly more nucleated settlement than we've seen elsewhere. So up in Bearley, just north of Redditch, the test pits there seem to have produced evidence of the settlement there being really scattered. So there wasn't one village centre, but lots of little separate clusters of houses kind of over quite a widespread area. In White Lady's Aston by Worcester, the village there seems to have been in 2 fairly distinct halves, possibly sort of an upper and a lower village. Up in Wolverley, we've got similar to Bearley, so probably a scatter across the parish, but with one kind of probably main settlement cluster where the later medieval tithe barn was built. In Witchingford, we've got probably a real scatter going on there. So Badsey is the first place where actually we do sort of have one slightly more concentrated selection of medieval pottery. It's possible that the settlement in Badsey was really quite concentrated, that actually we perhaps don't see medieval finds in other test pits kind of further out in the village, because it was perhaps quite tightly concentrated around the church and around that area, sort of at the southern end of the high street. And it may be that just the test pit's further away, just outside the occupation area, and we're just not seeing any of those finds because we're just not near enough to the centre. What that doesn't really explain, though, is that we haven't really seen much of this medieval manure scatter we would expect to see. So we would expect that all the medieval fields would produce lots of, well, not lots, but some recognisable, that all the test pits that are in medieval fields would produce some medieval pottery. Now, we can tell a little bit whether that's going on or not because of the condition of the pottery. So if you get really fresh bits of pottery with quite clean breaks, sharp breaks, then they haven't moved very far. If you've got really rolled around bits, that's definitely been in a field for a long time. Not very much of the pottery we found from Badsey, apart from the stuff really at test pit 18, looks that rolled around. So actually I should say test pits 18 and 19 definitely do look more like plough scatter. But I think this is perhaps something that we need to revisit, that perhaps pottery isn't travelling as far in some of the settlements as we would expect to see, and that perhaps people are keeping their rubbish a little bit nearer to where they're living than we might have initially expected. The interesting flip side to that is that in Witchingford we found virtually no medieval pottery within sites that are documented to have medieval occupation, and we think in Witchingford that all of their rubbish and all their medieval pottery is going on their fields, because bits of field walking have produced a lot of medieval pottery there. So actually I think we've perhaps got more of a change and differences going on across Worcestershire rather than one homogenous story, and that in some places people were managing the land in one way, and in other villages they were managing their fields in a different way, and that meant they were doing different things with their household rubbish, and archaeologically then we see it in different ways. Across all of the big digs, though, we have found virtually no pottery predating about 1150, so kind of the mid-12th century. The exception to that are two bits of pottery from White Ladies Aston. So you can see one on the slide there. There's one bit that dates from about the Norman Conquest and one piece that might be slightly earlier, but that's it. So from 96 test pits across 6 big digs, we just have 2 sherds of pottery that come from probably around the 10th or 11th century, nothing earlier. Now that's really striking because all of these settlements we know have occupation that predates that pottery. It's recorded in historic documents. It must be there somewhere. It might be that those very early settlements were in a totally different place to where we've been looking. But I think what is much more likely is that actually at that date, so before about 1150, rural Worcestershire either doesn't have access to or is choosing not to use pottery. Now, I think it's much more likely that actually people are choosing not to use pottery before this date. We see in earlier time periods and a bit later on pottery coming from quite a long way away. So that Newbury ware in the 12th century, some of the pottery, the Roman pottery comes from Badsey, comes from North Gloucestershire. If people wanted to get hold of pottery in sort of the 9th, 10th centuries, they could do. I think people are choosing not to because they don't want to use it for whatever reason. Now that raises a really interesting question of why then do people from around the mid-12th century start wanting to use ceramic cooking pots and ceramic jugs and sort of lots of ceramics in their kitchens. What it does mean is that we in Worcestershire are not going to be able to see that very early medieval phase of settlements through the pottery. And that's sharp contrast to places like East Anglia, where they do have pottery wares that are quite commonly used, sort of the 9th, 10th centuries, and you can see that phase of the settlement. And we're just not going to be able to see it in Worcestershire, which in some ways is quite disappointing to realise, but also raises a really interesting question of why is it different here, and why do people change and suddenly want pottery when they didn't want it before. So it's been a little bit of a whirlwind trip around the 19 test pits and sort of about 2,000 years of Badsey's history. So we couldn't fit it all in, but I hope you've enjoyed that overview. If you'd like to find out more, there will be an excavation report coming out on our website, so do have a look out for that. It should be on our website, which is explorethepast.co.uk, from around the end of April. There's also a project exhibition currently on at the Hive in Worcester, which is there until the 29th of March 2023. So do go and have a look at that if you're interested in seeing sort of the overall stories from the 6 big digs, and some artwork inspired by the finds as well. And just to give you a sneak peek, this is what the exhibition looks like. So we've got this wonderful cabinet of curiosities that's been made as well. Now, the last thing I want to say is a huge, big thank you to everyone who has made the dig possible. Whether you hosted a test pit, excavated in one, helped with the finds team, took photographs, helped in any other way, thank you very much. The dig would not have happened without you, and you really have contributed to some new stories and some new insights about Worcestershire's past that we didn't know before. I'd like to say a special thank you to Ian Gibson from the Badsey Society for coordinating everything and making the dig happen here, to Badsey Cubs and for use of their scout tool, as well as for taking part, and to everyone else who helped supervise over the weekend, take photographs and things like that. So thank you very much for listening, and to everyone else who has made this dig possible. So obviously the Badsey Society have been very heavily involved, but the wider project has been run by ourselves, Worcestershire Archive and Archaeology Service, on behalf of Worcestershire Archaeological Society, with funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So everyone who buys National Lottery tickets, thank you very much for making projects like this happen.